Hello, everyone. I'm Corey Schmidt, the ArchivesSpace Project Manager at the University of Georgia Libraries. I will be demonstrating how to migrate data from Archivists Toolkit to ArchivesSpace. To give an overview, there will be three parts to the migration process. The first part is the pre-migration, which consists of preparing your data and software. The second will be the migration itself, which involves setting up the Migrator plugin and applying the appropriate settings. And lastly, the post-migration will deal with checking the data, error logs, and reviewing some basic cleanup processes. Before we begin, I would like to point out that I'm running on a Windows 10 computer, so your settings and navigation might vary across a Mac OS X or Linux environment. I'm also using a Firefox browser. There are three things we need to do in order to prepare for the migration. First, we want to create copies of our existing Archivists Toolkit instance. We want to make sure that our existing ArchivesSpace instance does not have any data in it. And last, we want to download and install the latest version of Archivists Toolkit, which is version 2.0, update 16. The first step to pre-migration will be to copy the MySQL databases. So I'll be showing you the general steps, but not actually showing you on screen how to do it. I ask that you please consult with your IT department on how best to do this, as your institution might do it differently. The first step is we want to create an empty database where we can dump our data. Within the terminal, you will want to go to wherever you would like this copy database to live, and then simply create it. Then we will set permissions for that copy database, assigning it a username and password. We will need these credentials when we go to Archivists Toolkit from its interface to select the correct database. The second step is, after assigning a username and password with all privileges, we move on to dumping our existing production database into a file. In the terminal, navigate to where your current Archivists Toolkit database is located and copy it using a MySQL dump. Third, I should note that if the copy database you made exists in another host, you will need to transfer the dumped file from where it is now to where the copy database is. The third point is, lastly, we want to import the dumped database file into our new copy database using the command as listed on the presentation slide. And that's it. Now let's start with making sure our ArchivesSpace instance does not have any data. If you are being hosted by Lyrasis or any other hosting service and not hosting ArchivesSpace yourself, the process can be relatively straightforward. You want to ask your host contact to wipe the ArchivesSpace database and rebuild the index. ArchivesSpace already has resources available for doing this, but we will briefly walk through what needs to be done. Making sure that your ArchivesSpace instance has no data is straightforward, though it may differ if your host is based on a Linux or Windows server. This is a high-level take at what needs to be done. Before beginning, make sure no one is using or is finished using ArchivesSpace. If everyone has closed out of ArchivesSpace, then the first step is to stop ArchivesSpace. You can use the command archivespace.sh stop, or using systemctl stop aspace.service. Next, you'll want to delete the MySQL database. Deleting the database is permanent, so only do this if you are absolutely sure there is no information you need to keep. You can use the commands mysql show databases to reveal the databases in your environment, and then use the command drop database archivespace to delete the database. After deleting the database, we can create a new empty database. You can do this by using the script found in the script directory of your ArchivesSpace instance, labeled setup-database.sh. This creates the minimally required tables to get your ArchivesSpace database up and running. Lastly, you'll want to also delete the Solar index for ArchivesSpace. The Solar index acts as an in-between the database and your user interface that you interact with. By deleting the index, you will force ArchivesSpace to rebuild it based on the new database. This helps ensure there are no weird data errors in your user interface. ArchivesSpace has documentation for deleting the index found here. After that, you can start ArchivesSpace again. We navigate back to our ASpace instance, and you should find no information is available. Note that if you want to keep some of the data before you migrate, you can do that. If you wanted to save your users, for instance, the best way is to start with a clean, empty ArchivesSpace instance and add the users you want to keep next time you migrate to that database. Then you can ask your ArchivesSpace host to generate a copy of the database with just your user information. Then, saving that copy, the next time you migrate, the host can reload that copy of the database, saving you some time. Now we will focus on downloading the latest version of Archivists Toolkit. We want version 2.0, update 16. If you are unsure what version you're running, you can check when Archivists Toolkit first loads at the bottom of the screen, right below the title. You can see here it says version 2.0.0, update 16. Or you can log into Archivists Toolkit, navigate to the Help menu tab at the top, click About Archivists Toolkit, and the first line in the info box will tell you what version you are running. If you already have the appropriate version, feel free to skip ahead of this part. First, we will go to the Archivists Toolkit website. From here, we want to go to the top right corner and click the Download tab. Now, depending on your system, you can choose which to install. If you're curious, the links that say no VM, as right here, mean that the Archivists Toolkit version will not come with a Java environment. To make it easier, I use the version that includes the VM, this one here. That way, I don't have to mess around with installing a very, very old version of Java on my computer. We will go ahead and save the file, and it will download, and after it downloads, we will follow the on-screen instructions to install Archivists Toolkit onto our computer. I'll skip this part, but if you have any questions, please feel free to message the ArchivesSpace user group email listserv. Now that we have copies of our database and the most recent version of Archivists Toolkit, we can move on to linking them together. So from the login screen, we want to select a server. Here, we will enter the URL for our new copy database, as well as our username and password for accessing that database. We want to make sure that the database type is set to MySQL. So as you can see here, we have a copy database as indicated by the name copy, the username, and password. We can click Save, which will save these settings, and then click OK to go back to the login screen. Now we will enter the same credentials we used to log into our production space. And there we are. Right now we are accessing the copy database that we created back in the earlier steps. Now at this point comes evaluating your data. This process varies from institution to institution, but the same principles can be applied. Basically, we want to make sure to correct any obvious errors in the data that we know might cause issues. Some of these include: check any user-defined fields for accessions and resources, and if there are more appropriate fields in ArchivesSpace for the data. You can find this in Archivists Toolkit settings under Setup, Configure Application, Accessions and Resources. If you are migrating multiple repositories into one instance of ArchivesSpace, if there are conflicting user-defined fields, you will need to resolve those. The field names will not migrate, so you will have to go in and modify your ArchivesSpace instance, which will apply to all repositories. Do you have any practices or rules that did not comply with Archivists Toolkit validation? If so, these may not be compatible with ArchiveSpace. Archivists Toolkit audit metadata does not migrate to ArchiveSpace, so keep this in mind as well. Check for what fields are standardized as best as possible. This includes dates, resource identifiers, accession numbers, finding aid unique identifiers, and others. There are ways to check for this in Archivists Toolkit, as well as MySQL. See Orbis Cascades Guide for more info on this found here. If you're using special text characters like umlauts, accents, trailing white spaces, and others, this is a great candidate for MySQL automated jobs. So if you're interested in this, again, see Orbis Cascades Guide. Looking at the controlled vocabularies or lookup lists, you may have to merge or edit records. This is especially true if you have multiple repositories that are using duplicate extent types, container types, instance types, etc. For subjects and names, or agents, this is slightly mitigated by the fact that the migrator will not migrate duplicate subjects if they match exactly. However, even if they differ by a single character or space, they will be migrated as a unique subject or name. It is up to your institution whether to do subject and name cleanup before or after migrating to ArchiveSpace. For lookup lists, it's helpful to run Archivists Toolkit record count button. If you navigate to a list such as extent types, you can have Archivists Toolkit see how many records are associated with an extent type. There are known issues with Archivists Toolkit doing very large merges and not being very successful at them. So if you're having trouble, it may be worth trying to merge types and controlled vocabularies in ArchivesSpace instead. If you don't use barcodes, but have box numbers within a resource, you will have to make sure that the boxes are distinct. For instance, if box 1 for series 1 and box 1 for series 2 are migrated as is, ArchiveSpace will consider that one container, which is not wanted behavior. Yale's blog post mentioned doing a similar process of creating faux barcodes. A link to their blog post will be at the end of the presentation. Lastly, if you have resource components, be them files or items, that have unique identifiers, but have the same barcodes without a container, the migrator will override the unique identifiers. This results in the wrong unique identifiers being associated to specific items with the same barcodes. To fix this, consider creating fake containers to prevent this behavior. If after evaluating your data, you are pretty satisfied with where it is, then make sure to pick out a selection of resources, accessions, and digital objects that you know are weird and normal. It's almost impossible to examine all of the data being migrated between the systems. So choosing a sampling to take a closer look at can be helpful in determining what data to expect to clean up pre and post migration. If you are unsure what data to clean up or are overwhelmed with the amount of cleanup, an important thing to remember is that this is an iterative process. Once you have these steps down pat, you can conduct as many migrations as you want and chip away at data cleanup every time.